Hello student, I'm Vasundhara Dada and welcome back to my channel English Literature. And today we are going to see the law generation writers. Let's get going. A young group of writers. Therefore, a young group of writers emerged after the First World War to establish new style in American fiction. And these are the writers: Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound, Stuart Anderson, T.S. Eliot, E. Cummings, Malcolm Cowley, William Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, O'Neill, and many other novelists, dramatists, critics joined this revolt. And in fact, it was not a movement but a revolt. These young men were known as the Lost Generation because they revolted and rebelled against the traditional standards of morality and taste, reacting against the conventional standards imposed upon them by society. And they sought personal experience intense emotional experiences and extravagant forms of play, and their rebellion against traditional standards led them to seek new values and new techniques to express more realistically the conflict which they experienced. And they gave birth a new cycle of American literature, which is creatively and productively compares favorably with the Romantic period of this 19th century. And this give the they all writers gave the new birth for new cycle in American literature in 19th 20th century. So let's get going one by one. First of all, we see about the great Rude Stein, who is very prominent writer because she coined uh, the term the lost generation. She was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, to an upper middle class Jewish immigrant family. She became then a kind of Freudian psychologist, worded this decade as the lost generation, and they coined this term the lost generation, and it was popularized by Ernest Hemingway, who used it in the epigraph of the for his 1926 novel The Sun Also Rises, and you are all a lost generation, like this. Okay, let's see the story behind of this term, how it coined, and what is the incidence behind of that. That a great Rude Stein with Ernest Hemingway's son Jack in 1924, Stein is created the bringing the term lost generation into use in his the memoir A Movable Feast in 1964, and published after Hemingway's writes that Stein heard the phrase from the French garage owner who served Stein's car. And when a young mechanic failed to repair the car quickly enough, and the garage owner shouted at the young man, "You are all a generation prelude." And while telling Hemingway the story, Stein added, "That is what you are. That's what you all are. All of you, young lost generation." Hemingway thus credits the phrase to Stein, who was then his mentor and patron. Like this concept emerged, and that concept this concept is used by Ernest Hemingway in his writing The Sun Also Rises in 1926. Okay, let's see next one. Next one is Dos Passos. John Rodrigo Dos Passos, who was born in January 14, 1896, and then September 28, 1970. And Don Passos was an American novelist, most notable for his USA trilogy. He was born in Chicago and he was graduated from Howard College in 1916. He traveled widely as a young man visiting Europe and the Middle East, and where he learned about literature, art, and architecture. And during World War I, he was an ambulance driver for American volunteer groups in Paris and Italy before joining the US Army Medical Corps. Considered as one of the lost generation writer, and his writing is one man's initiation in 1917, first novel in 1920, which was written in the trenches during World War I, and it was followed by an anti-war novel, and the Three Soldier, which brought him considerable recognition. And next one is the New York City 1925 novel about life. Manhattan Transfer is next one, which was published in 1925, was a commercial success. He had introduced the experimental stream of consciousness techniques. And the USA trilogy, of course. In this trilogy, there's three books are consisted. That first is the 42nd parallel, which was published in 1930, and next one is a 1919, and this published in 1932, and the next one is the Big Money in 1936. uh, and these three books are together in the USA trilogy. These ideas are also coalesced into, of which the first book appeared in 1930. And next one is was ranked by the Modern Liberty in 1998 as the 23rd of the 100 best English language novels of the 20th century, written in experimental, non-linear form. The trilogy blends elements of biography and news reports to paint a landscape of 20th century American culture. And this is the Dos Pesos who gave the a lot of and great contribution in this law generation writer, as a law generation writer. Okay, let's see next one. Next one is Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Miller Hemingway was born in July 21st, 1899, and died in July 2nd, 1961. He was an American journalist, novelist, short story writer, and sportsman. Economical and understands style, which he termed the iceberg theory, had a strong influence on 20th century fiction. His adventurous lifestyle and his public image brought him admiration from later generations. And Hemingway produced most of his work between the mid 1920s and the mid 1950s. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. It was for his mastery of the art of the narrative, most recently demonstrated in The Old Man and the Sea. This is a very beautiful novella, and for the influence that he was exerted on a contemporary style. He published seven novels, six short story collections, two non-fiction works, and three of his novels, four short story collection, three non-fiction works were published posthumously. He published seven novels, six short story collections, and two non-fiction works. Three of his novels, four short story collections, and three non-fiction works were published posthumously. Many of his works are considered classics of American literature. Before leaving for the Italian front to enlist as an ambulance driver in World War I in 1980, he was seriously wounded and returned home, and his wartime experience formed in the basis of his novel, A Farewell to Arms in 1926. Really, it is very sensitive and very beautiful novel, A Farewell to Arms. And then, Loud Generation, a term Hemingway popularized with the publication of The Sun Also Rises in 1925. The New York Times wrote in 1926 of Hemingway's first novel. No amount of analysis can convey the quality of The Sun Also Rises. The Sun Also Rises is written in the spare, tight prose that made Hemingway famous, and according to James Nagel, changed the nature of American writing. That James Nagel's comment on his writing in 1954. Let's see next one. Next one is Scott Fitzgerald, who was born in September 24, 1896, and in December 21st, 1940. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was an American novelist, essayist, screenwriter, and short story writer. Although he was best known for his novels depicting the flamboyance and excess of the Jazz Age, a term which he coined. So, what is Jazz Age? That in 1920, the younger generation seemed so wild, irresponsible, immoral in social behavior, and it was the exhibition of the degeneration of jazz or mad youth. and life in 1920s, that jazz parties, drugstore cowboys, moral and stylistic fashionable men paved the way of revolt, and sidewise there was economic uncertainty, and there were many social, economic, political problems, and this was the period of depression, also called the period of depression, and this is the jazz age, and this term is coined by this Fitzgerald, and during his lifetime he published four novels, four collection of short stories, and 164 short stories, and although he temporarily achieved a popular success and fortune in 1920s, only received wide critical and popular acclaim after his death. He is widely regarded as one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century, and his writing, let's see, The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night, and The Last Tycoon. These are the famous work which is written by Scott Fitzgerald. Okay, let's see next one. That Stuart Anderson, who was born in September 13, 1876, and died in March 8, 1941. And Stuart Anderson was born as an American novelist and short story writer known for subjective and self-revealing works, self-educated. He rose to become a successful copywriter and business owner in Cleveland and Elyria, Ohio in 1912. Anderson had a nervous breakdown that led him to abandon his business and family to become a writer. His most enduring work is the short story sequence at Winesburg, Ohio, which launched his career throughout the 1920s. Anderson published several short story collections, novels, memoirs, books of essays, and a book of poetry. Though his books sold reasonably well, Dark Laughter 1925, a novel inspired by Anderson's time in New Orleans during 1920, was his only bestseller. And the first novel is Windy Macpherson Sons 1916 as a part of three book, and deal with John Lane. And second book is Marching Men in 1917 are usually considered his apprentice novel because they came before Anderson found fame with the Winsburg, Ohio 1919, and are generally considered inferior in quality works that followed it. Anderson's most notable work is his collection of interrelated short stories, Winsburg, Ohio in 1919. In his memoir, he wrote that Hans, the opening story, was the first real story he ever wrote, and instead of emphasizing plot and action, Anderson used a simple. Anderson was one of the first American novelists to introduce new insights from psychology, including Freudian analysis. And the remaining part of Stuart Anderson, that he then published in 1920 that Poor White, then 1923 Many Marriages, and in it he explored the new sexual freedom, a theme which he continued in Dark Laughter and later writing. Dark Laughter had its detractors, but the reviews were on the whole positive, and F. Scott Fitzgerald considered Many Marriages to be Anderson's finest novel. And although the book was satirized by Ernest Hemingway in his novella and The Torrents of Spring, it was a bestseller at the time and the only book of Anderson's to reach that status during his lifetime. And this Ernest Stewart Anderson gave great contribution in this as a lost generation writer. Let's see next one. Next one is a Thomas Stone Eliot. We know T.S. Eliot and was born in September 26, 1888 and died in 1965. He lived in St. Louis during the first 18 years of his life and attended Howard University. In 1910, he led the university states for the Sorbonne, having earned both undergraduate and master degrees and having contributed several poems to the Howard Advocate. And it was in London that Eliot came under the influence of his contemporary Ezra Pound, who recognized his poetic genius at once and assisted in the publication of his work in a number of magazines, most notable the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in poetry in 1915, and is the first book of poem that Prufrock and other observations in 1970, and immediately established him as a leading poet of the avant-garde. And the well known that the Westland in 1922 was considered by many to be the single most influential poetic work of the 20th century, that the Westland. And Eliot's reputation began to grow to nearly mythic proportions by 1930. And for the next 30 years, he was the most dominant figure in the poetry and literary criticism in the English speaking world. And because of only the Wasteland, which was published in 1922, and that's why he was very famous in 1930, and he dominated figure in the poetry and the literary criticism. As a poet, he transmitted his affinity for the English metaphysical poet of the 17th century. In 19th century, French symbolist poets, including Baudelaire and Laforgue, for into radical inventions in poetic technique and subject matter. His poems, in many respects, articulated the disillusionment of younger poets, the World War First generation, with the values and conventions, both literary and social, of the Victorian era. As a critic, also he had an enormous impact on contemporary literary tastes, propounding views that after his conversion to Orthodox Christianity in the late 30s were increasingly based in social and religious conservatism. Let's see the remaining part. The T.S. Eliot's that Ash Wednesday, also very famous in 1930, and the Four Quarters in 1943. His books of literary and social criticism include The Sacred Wood in 1920, the use of poetry and the use of criticism in 1933, after Strange Gods in 1934, and Notes Towards the Definition of Culture in 1940. And Eliot was also an important playwright whose verse dramas include The Murder in the Cathedral and The Family Reunion and The Cocktail Party. These are all are very famous work of T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948 and died in London in 1965. So T.S. Eliot gave the great contribution in American literature, and this is a very fabulous and fantastic writing and experimental and that something different and innovational work which is given by T.S. Eliot. Let's see next one. Let's see the Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound in the Ezra Lomis Pound, who was born in October 30th, 1885, Hele Ladiho and US, and died in November 1st, 1972, Venice, Italy. He was an American poet and critic, a supremely discerning and energetic entrepreneur of the arts who did more than any other single figure to advance a modern movement in English and American literature. Pound promoted and also occasionally helped to shape the work of such wildly different poets and novelists as William Butler Yeats, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Robert Frost, D.H. Lawrence, and T.S. Eliot. His pro-fascist broadcast in Italy during World War II led to his post-war arrest and confinement until 1958. Though his friend Eds had already become famous, Pound succeeded in persuading him to adopt a new linear style of poetic composition. And in 1940, the year of his marriage to Dorothy Shakespeare, daughter of Ed's friend Olivia Shakespeare, and he began a collaboration with the with then unknown James Joyce as the unofficial editor of the Egoist, London, and later as a London editor of the Little Review, New York City. He saw the publication of Joyce's novel, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses, thus spreading Joyce's name and securing financial assistance for him. In the same year, he gave T.S. Eliot a similar start in his career as a poet and critic. Okay, and then Ismin, its friend is Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound helped T.S. Eliot you that memorize all the chain. And in the Pound the continued to publish his own poetry that Reports in 1912, Lycetta in 1916, and prose criticism, Pavonage and Divisions in 1918. From the literary remains the great Orientalist Ernest Hemingway, which had been presented to Pound in 1913. He succeeded in publishing highly acclaimed English versions of early Chinese poetry, Cathay in 1915, and two volumes of Japanese no plays in 1916 and 17 as well. Let's see the remaining part of is around that homage to sex's properties in the book Pure Purple MV in 1919 and that Selvan Mulvaney in 1920. Properties is a comment on the British Empire in 1917 by way of properties and the Roman Empire. Finally, sizzled the portrait of one aspects of British literary culture in 1919 and was one of the most praised poems of the 20th century. And he is a 1911 version of the Anglo-Saxon poem Seafarer and the Confidence Free verse of the written in 1912. So, like other poet, Ezra Pound also gave a great contribution in the Lost Generation era. Let's see next one. Igone Gladstone O'Neill was born in October 16, 1888 and died in November 27, 1953. And he was an American playwright and a Nobel laureate in literature. O'Neill's plays were among the first to include speeches in American English vernacular and involved character on the fringes of society. They struggle to maintain their hopes and aspirations, but ultimately slide into disillusionment and despair. Of his very few comedies, only one is well known, Wilderness. Nearly all of his other plays involve some degree of tragedy and personal pessimism. And his work is Bread and Butter in 1914 and The Hairy Ape 1922. Area app also very interesting and very something different and it shows the discrimination in those days. So it is a very beautiful novel as well and this O'Neill gave the great contribution to Lost Generation as a Lost Generation writer. Next one, that E. Cummings is when full the Edward S. Lane Cummings who was born in October 14th, 1894, Cambridge, Massachusetts, US, and died September 3rd, 1962, North Conway, New Hampshire. And he was also American poet and painter who first attached attention in the age of literary experimentation of his unconventional punctuation and phrasing. During World War I, he served with an ambulance corpus in France where he was interned for a time in detention camp because of his friendship with an American who had written letters home that the French censors thought critical of the war efforts, and this experience depends Cummings' distrust and officialdom and was symbolically recounted in his first book, The Enormous Room, in 1922. His first book of verse, that To Live and Chimney, in 1923, it was followed by 41 poems uh, and 1925. And in that year, he received the Dial Award for distinguished service to American letters. Then Emmy in 1933 recorded in 432 pages of experimental prose and a 36 days visit to the Soviet Union. Like this, coming also give us some experimental or innovation work in those era. Let's see next one. Next one is Malcolm Cowley. Malcolm Cowley was born in August 24th, 1898, Belsenno, Pennsylvania, US, and died March 27, 1989, New Milford, Connecticut. And he was an American literary critic and social historian who chronicled the writers of the lost generation of the 1920s and their successor. He as a literary editor of the New Republic from 1929 to 1944. With a generally leftist position on cultural questions, he played a significant part in many of the literary and political battles of the Depression years. We saw that why we call that Great Depression year, because that time that economic uncertainty and there were many social, economical, and political problems, and that's why this period also called the Depression years. College grew up in Pittsburgh. His education at Howard was interrupted during World War I, and when he joined the American Field Service as an ambulance driver in France and attended for a brief period a U.S. Army artillery officers training school. 1951 under the subtitle A Literary Odyssey of the 1920s is an important social and literary history of the expedite American writers of the 1920s. The Literary Situation 1954 and the collection of the criticism and comment Think Back on Us 1967 and a many Windowed House 1970. In 1980 he published the well received The Dream of the Golden Mountains Remembering the 1930s, a social and cultural history of the Great Depression and the New Deal. Okay, this is the great work which is give a great contribution in this lost generation era by Malcolm Cowley. Let's see. Okay, here are all writers I covered it, and here the lost generation writers, and here all those writers gave the great contribution in this lost generation era. And for actually the lost generation was never lost, and it was shocked, uprooted for a time. That bitter, critical, rebellious, and iconoclastic experimental, often misdirected, but was never lost more. And many new experiments as regarded the style, arranging, and managing of ideas, themes, and use of day-to-day imagery and symbolism, and were made and experimented. Thus, in 1920s, the period which is we call them generally known as the lost generation, and is a landmark in the history of the 20th century American literature. So let's see, here I covered all the law generation writer, and these are the all law generation writers book which is very famous and turned the American literature in 20th century, and their literature may at first perhaps may confuse the readers, and yet it is definitely interesting, informative, and impressionistic as well. So these all are books very great, like The Wasteland, Ulysses, and The Egoistes, and The Old Man and the Sea of Ernest Hemingway, One Man's Initiation in 1970, The Sun Also Rises, where the law generation term is popular by that Ernest Hemingway, and the movable feast, which is first time this term is included in that book, and the Great Gatsby and Dark Laughter. These all are fabulous and very interesting, impressionistic, and informative books. So if you get time to read all these books and try to read that all books of Law Generation writer. So students, if you like this video, actually all this information I collected from various books and Google and Wikipedia and much work which is done already by those law generation writers, so it is not easy to cover all the data, and I try to collected all information in this video. Hope you like this, and you get more information about this all law generation writer. So please leave your comment in comment box, like it, share, subscribe it if you are not subscribed it till now, so please subscribe it and press the bell icon. So students, keep learning, keep touching, and stay healthy. Thank you so much.